The auctioneer had been talking for 3 minutes and nobody had moved. It was a Tuesday morning in early September, 1990, the kind of morning where the air still smelled like summer, but something in it told you summer was already gone. Roger Lane's equipment lot sat on the edge of Harmon County, Iowa, a gravel-covered acre outside of Clarion where old machines went to wait for someone to decide what they were worth. Most of them got bought. Some of them got stripped. A few just sat. The grain dryer sitting at the far end of the row had been sitting for a while. It was a 1968 batch dryer, a big, boxy machine built back when grain drying was a whole different operation. The panels were the color of old rust. The fan housing had a dent in the side that looked like something had backed into it, maybe more than once. The belt guard was broken at the hinge and hung at an angle. There was a manufacturer's plate on the front, but the text had faded to almost nothing. Someone had stacked 2 flat tires against the base of it, as if they'd given up deciding where else to put them. The auctioneer pointed at it like he was doing a reluctant favor. 1968 grain dryer. Batch style, as is condition. No warranty, no parts guarantee, no nothing. Roger tells me it hasn't fired up in about 20 years. We'll start at 100. Silence. He dropped it. $50. More silence. A few people looked at their shoes. Carl Barnes, who farmed 400 acres 3 miles north of town, glanced at it and looked away the same second. Scrap value alone is worth something. That was when Maggie Turner raised her hand. 80, she said. She didn't say it loud. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She was standing near the edge of the crowd in a canvas work coat that had seen better decades, holding a paper cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. 53 years old, gray starting to come through her brown hair, the kind of face that spent too much time in the weather to be described as anything except honest. The auctioneer looked at her. He looked at the dryer. He looked back at her. Sold. $80. Someone near Cal Barnes laughed. Not mean exactly, more like the kind of laugh that comes when something happens that doesn't quite make sense. Cal himself just shook his head slowly and turned back toward the newer equipment. Roger Lane walked over to Maggie while she was filling out the paperwork. He wasn't unkind about it. He was just being honest, the way people are when they're trying to save you from yourself. I know, Maggie said. Parts are going to be near impossible to find for that generation of dryer. Probably. He waited, like he expected her to explain. She didn't. She handed the paperwork back to the woman behind the card table and finished what was left of her coffee. Roger watched her walk toward her truck. He'd been in the equipment business for 22 years. He'd seen farmers make bad decisions before. This one just seemed quieter than most. Ethan Turner was 24 and had been farming alongside his mother for 2 years since coming back from a brief and unsuccessful attempt at a business degree in Des Moines. He was standing in the equipment yard when the flatbed pulled in with the dryer loaded on it, and his first thought was that they'd brought the wrong machine. "What is that?" he said. He wasn't entirely a question. 68 batch dryer, Maggie said, climbing out of the truck. He walked around it once. The rust was worse up close. The broken belt guard scraped against the housing when the truck had gone over the gravel, and it was still swinging slightly. There was corn chaff packed into the bottom of the fan housing so thick it looked like insulation. "Mom, help me get it off the flatbed. Did you pay money for this?" $80. He looked at her. She was already walking around the back to unhook the tie-downs. $80 for a dead dryer. "It's not dead," she said. "It stopped. There's a difference." He wanted to ask what the difference was, but something in her voice, not sharp, not dismissive, just settled, made him pick up the other end of the strap instead. They unloaded the dryer in about 40 minutes, which was harder than it sounds, and set it on the concrete pad behind the main bin. Maggie stood back and looked at it for a moment like she was reading something on it that nobody else could see. Then she went inside and made lunch. Ethan stood there a little longer, looking at the dryer. Then he followed her in. Word travels fast in a rural county, and by the next morning, at least 3 people had told the story of Maggie Turner buying Roger Lane's junk dryer for $80. The version that Cal Barnes heard had her paying $120. The version that reached Tom Willis at the county elevator had her planning to use it as a corn crib. Tom was the elevator manager. He'd been running the Clarion Farmers Cooperative Elevator for 11 years and had seen the facility upgrade twice in that time. Newer continuous flow dryers expanded bin capacity, a conveyor system that had cost more than some of the farms that used it. He ran a tight, professional operation, and he was proud of how it performed in a normal year. When someone mentioned Maggie's dryer to him over coffee at the diner, he didn't hesitate. "Nobody uses batch dryers anymore," he said. "You'd spend a whole day drying what a commercial dryer handles in an hour. It's not a realistic solution for anything." He wasn't wrong about the numbers. That was the thing about Tom Willis. He was usually right about the numbers. What he hadn't fully accounted for was what happens when the numbers stop being enough. Maggie started the inspection that Saturday morning. She didn't call anyone. She didn't make a plan, she wrote down. She pulled on a pair of work gloves and an old coverall that had belonged to her father, took a flashlight and a basic set of hand tools, and climbed up on the dryer platform with a thermos of coffee sitting below her on the ground. Her father's name had been Harold Geske. He'd spent 31 years as a mechanic at the Humboldt County Elevator, the kind of man who knew a grain dryer the way a doctor knows an X-ray. Not just what it looked like, but what it was supposed to look like. He used to bring Maggie to the elevator on Saturdays when she was a girl, and she'd stand beside him while he pulled fan housings and checked burner nozzles and retention belts, and he'd narrate what he was doing the way other fathers narrated baseball games. She had learned to read a grain dryer the way most people learn to read a face. You look at it long enough and it tells you what's wrong. She started with the fan housing because that's where you start. The fan bearing was seized. That was obvious from the outside. You could try to spin the shaft by hand and it didn't move. A seized bearing was not a death sentence for a machine. It meant the machine had sat long enough for the grease to harden and the metal to rust into itself. But bearings could be replaced. She noted it. The belt was cracked through on one side, not frayed, which would have been a different kind of problem, but cracked from age and dry rot. A cracked belt could be matched. She noted it. She pulled the burner access panel and shined the flashlight in. The nozzle was clogged with a combination of old fuel residue and dust. The safety switch on the burner assembly had rusted in place, which meant even if you got everything else running, the machine would refuse to fire because it was reading as unsafe. That was important, she noted it. The wiring behind the control box had sections where the insulation had been eaten through mice, almost certainly. The chewing was old and the nests were long abandoned. The damaged sections were short enough that they could be spliced. She noted that too. The airflow screens at the base of the dryer, the intake screens that pulled air up through the grain during a drying cycle, were packed. Not dirty, packed. Layers of chaff and dust and what might have been a mouse's entire grain collection at some point compressed into the screen until almost no air was getting through. She sat back on the platform for a moment. The thing about a grain dryer, the thing most people don't think about, is that the heat is almost secondary. Heat without airflow doesn't dry corn. It bakes it, kills the germ, renders it lower quality or worthless. What actually pulls moisture out of grain is moving air. Heat makes the air more capable of holding moisture, but the air has to move through the grain for any of that to work. Those clogged screens were why the machine had probably been abandoned in the first place. Someone had run it, the airflow had dropped, the temperatures had climbed too high trying to compensate. Maybe they'd replaced it with something newer and just left this one sitting. 20 years of sitting had done the rest. The machine wasn't dead, it was clogged. Maggie climbed down, refreshed her coffee, and made a list. October came in wet. That wasn't unusual for northern Iowa. Wet Octobers happened, but this one stacked on top of a September that had already been running behind. Corn that should have been coming down to 17–18% moisture by late September was sitting at 22–23% in some fields. You couldn't store corn safely at 22%. It would heat in the bin. It would mold. You'd lose it. The radio started running extended forecasts that made farmers stop what they were doing to listen. Rain predicted through the second week of October. Temperatures dropping. If the corn didn't come off soon at high moisture and get dried before going into storage, people were looking at serious losses. At the elevator, Tom Willis was already watching the line grow. By the first full week of October, the cooperative's dryers were running around the clock and wagons were still backed up past the scale house. The line stretched down the county road, gravity boxes and semi-loads sitting nose to tail in the gravel, engines idling, farmers sitting in their cabs watching the clock. In a normal year, a farmer might wait 45 minutes. That week, the wait was pushing 5 hours. Some days, 6. The problem was not just volume, it was moisture. Wet corn takes longer to dry. More time in the dryer per bushel means fewer bushels per hour, means the line moves slower, even though everyone is pushing harder. Tom had his staff running the dryers at the edge of their rated capacity, checking discharge temperatures, managing grain flow carefully to avoid scorching. He couldn't squeeze much more out of the system without damaging the grain he was trying to save. Farmers who'd put corn up earlier in September at around 20% moisture, thinking they'd beaten the weather, were now getting calls from the elevator telling them their drying appointments were days out. Some of them drove over to check their bins and didn't like what they found. Grain that had been sitting at high moisture for 2 weeks in a sealed bin had started to warm, not dramatically, but enough to worry about. Warm grain moves toward mold. Mold moves toward loss. He sat in his truck at the end of the line for a minute and did the math in his head. He didn't like the answer. He had a state-of-the-art commercial drying system. He had trained staff and a maintenance schedule and capital expense plans and everything organized on paper. What he did not have was any more drying capacity than he already had. The system was full, and the rain wasn't finished. Cal Barnes was in that line on a Thursday morning when he'd been there once already that week. He had about 12,000 bushels sitting in 2 main bins, most of it at 21 to 22% moisture. He'd put up an electric aeration fan on the warmer bin, which helped slow things down but didn't solve anything. Cooling grain buys time. It doesn't remove moisture. He could feel the window closing. Every day he waited in this line was a day the grain in that bin was 1 degree warmer than the day before. He had a neighbor who'd lost a bin to spoilage in a wet year back in the late 80s. He still talked about it. Cal was not going to be that story. On his way home that Thursday evening, he drove past Maggie Turner's farm. He slowed the truck. The old dryer was running. He could see the exhaust from the burner stack, thin and clean. He could hear the fan, that low, constant sound a working dryer makes that you don't notice until you're a farmer in October, and then you notice it immediately. There was an auger moving grain into the top of the machine, and the discharge auger was running at the bottom. The temperature gauge on the control box was visible from the road, its needle sitting steady. He sat there long enough that a car came up behind him and had to go around. He drove home, but he thought about it all evening. The repair had taken most of September. The airflow screens had been cleaned first. A half-day job with stiff brushes and a shop vac. The seized bearing had come out with heat and a bearing puller, and a replacement had arrived from a farm supply catalog in Ames after the local co-op came up empty. The belt had been matched to a standard size and replaced. The wiring repairs had taken 2 evenings, splice by splice, with Maggie checking continuity with a multimeter after each section. The burner nozzle had been soaked for 2 days, cleaned with a fine wire brush and compressed air, and inspected against the original specification from a manual tucked inside the control box cover, faded and water-stained but still readable. The rusted safety switch had been replaced with a unit sourced from a dealer in Minnesota who'd found old stock in a back room. Ethan had stopped asking why she was doing this. He'd started asking how. "You're fixing it from the outside in," he said one evening, watching her work. "But why'd you start with the screens instead of the bearing?" "Because the bearing doesn't matter if there's no airflow," she said. "You fix what kills the process first, then you fix what runs the process." He thought about that. "So you're working backwards from the grain." She looked at him. "Yeah," she said, "that's right." She went back to what she was doing, but he caught something in her expression, not pride exactly, more like recognition, like he'd said something that meant she hadn't been wasting her time explaining. The first test run had almost been a disaster. This was 3 days before the heavy rain arrived. Maggie declared the machine ready and they loaded a test batch, about 200 bushels of their own wet corn, and fired it up for the first time. The fan came on, the burner lit. That was good. The temperature gauge climbed past the target range inside of 8 minutes. Ethan saw it first. There's a quality to the sound of a dryer fan that changes when airflow is compromised. The pitch shifts slightly, the RPM sounds labored. She crouched at the base intake screen and put her hand near it. The airflow was wrong, still restricted somewhere. "Shut the burner down," she said. "Leave the fan." Ethan killed the burner. Maggie pulled the front access panel and looked inside the airflow path. Deep behind the cleaned screen, packed into a corner of the internal duct, there was a second mass of compacted chaff, old and dense, almost like felt, that hadn't been visible from the outside and hadn't budged under the shop vac. She pulled it out in pieces. 20 minutes of work. When they relit the burner and ran it again, the temperature climbed smoothly, leveled at the target, and held there. Ethan watched the gauges for a long time without speaking. "Dad would have just bought a new dryer," he finally said, quietly, without any edge to it, just observation. "Maybe," Maggie said, "but your grandfather would have fixed this one." Tom Willis drove out to Maggie's on a Thursday afternoon during the worst week of the harvest backup. The dryer was running when he pulled in. Maggie was at the control box logging a temperature reading in her small notebook. She looked up when she heard his truck. He stood beside her and looked at the machine without speaking for a moment. It was not a beautiful machine. It looked like what it was. Old equipment brought back from a long sleep by someone who'd known where to look, but it was running clean and steady, and right now steady was the only thing that mattered. "How much can you run through it in a day?" he asked. 300, maybe 350 bushels. Depends on starting moisture," he nodded. That was a fraction of what one of his commercial dryers handled per hour. He knew it. She knew it. But he was standing here anyway, which told her something had shifted in how he was thinking about the problem. "Some of those farmers have hot grain in bins at home, and they're sitting in my queue hoping to get through before dark." He paused. "Your dryer can't solve that. But there are farmers with 200 bushels of seed corn that can't wait 4 days for a drying appointment. There are bins with a small hot pocket that just need the top layer moved and dried before the whole bin goes. That's not a volume problem." "No," she said again. He looked at the machine. "I've been thinking about this wrong," he said. "I kept measuring it against commercial capacity. That's not what this is." "It's a backup," Maggie said. "It was always a backup. The commercial system handles the normal year. The backup handles what the normal system can't reach when it's full." Tom was quiet for a moment. In 11 years managing the elevator, he had planned for volume. He had planned for equipment failure. He had not planned for the scenario where the equipment worked perfectly and simply ran out of room. That was the gap. And the gap had been sitting behind Maggie Turner's bin on a concrete pad for 2 months, and he dismissed it in a diner conversation without giving it 10 seconds of serious thought. "Your father teach you that?" he said. "He showed me what broke when the wet year came," she said. "I just paid attention." Cow barns pulled into Maggie's lane 2 days later. He sat in his truck at the end of the drive for a long moment before getting out. He walked up to the dryer and Maggie came out of the shop and they stood there. "I need a favor," he said. "How much and what moisture?" He blinked. He'd expected more preamble. "About 800 bushels, most of it around 22%. One bin starting to get warm at the top." A bin getting warm meant the grain was beginning to respire. The biological process that starts when wet grain sits and microorganisms begin working through it. Left alone, you'd lose grade. If it got far enough, you'd lose the grain itself. "I can't do 800 in one run," she said. "Bring me the worst 200 first. Let's get the hot grain out of there before it moves down into the pile." He looked at her for a moment. "I laughed when you bought this thing," he said. Maggie looked at the dryer. "A machine doesn't die when it gets old," she said. "It dies when nobody remembers what it was built to do." She said it the way she said most things. Not like a lesson, just like something obvious to her, the way soil moisture is obvious to someone who's been farming long enough. "What are you charging?" he asked. "What the elevator charges. Don't make it complicated." Maggie dried her own corn first. That needs to be said plainly. She wasn't running a charity, and she wasn't making a point. She had her own grain to protect, her own bins to manage, her own harvest to finish. The dryer ran her corn through at roughly 300 bushels a day, which wasn't fast by commercial standards, but was running on mornings when the elevator queue was already an hour long before sunrise. She helped with 3 other farms during the worst of it. Cal's hot grain came first, then a neighbor with 200 bushels of seed corn that couldn't risk sitting in the commercial line. Then a small emergency load from a farm on the north end of the county whose bin temperature was climbing faster than the family was comfortable with. None of these were large jobs. Each one was the right size for what the old dryer could do. She kept precise records in a small green notebook: moisture in, temperature setting, moisture out, bushels processed, time elapsed. Her father had kept notebooks exactly like this. She'd read all of them after he died in 1989, not for the numbers, but for the way he thought about the machines. Ethan had started keeping his own notebook, but she noticed the pencil he was keeping on the ledge by the control box, and she recognized what it meant. She didn't say anything. She just left the pencil where it was. The rain broke in the last days of October. Fields dried enough to run equipment, and farmers pushed hard through November, working long days to get the rest of the crop off. The elevator processed an enormous volume. Tom's drying line eventually worked through the backlog. The season closed without the kind of widespread loss that had seemed possible at the worst of it, though a few farms took real hits on grain that had dropped in grade from sitting too long at high moisture. The farms that had somewhere else to go during those 2 critical weeks had come through cleaner. Tom Willis went back to his office afterward and started writing. He called the document the Wet Year Protocol, a set of procedures and contacts for managing overflow during high moisture harvest seasons. It covered staffing, dryer capacity, priority loads, and a contact list for off-site drying resources in the county. Maggie Turner's name and phone number were in it, listed under emergency backup capacity. He'd never told her. He was fairly sure she wouldn't care. She wouldn't. The following fall, Cal Barnes showed up at an auction in Wright County and paid $65 for a 1971 batch dryer. It was in worse condition than Maggie's machine had been. The fan housing had a crack that needed welding, and the wiring had been damaged further than just mice. It took him longer to rebuild than he expected. He called Maggie 3 times with questions and wrote down her answers each time. When it ran clean on a test cycle the August before harvest, he called her. "Ran good," he said, 2 hours without a temperature spike. "What was your airflow restriction?" "About 40%. Chaff and an old mouse nest packed into the duct. That'll do it every time," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what you said. About machines dying when nobody remembers what they were built for." My father scrapped one of these back in '78, said it was obsolete. Probably seemed like it then." "Yeah?" He paused. "Anyway, it runs." "Good. Grease the bearing before every season," she said. "Those old housings will seize fast if you let them sit." "Already wrote it down," he said. "The dryer is still standing on Maggie Turner's farm. It doesn't run every season. In dry years, with a clear elevator line and corn coming off at good moisture, it sits under its tarp and rests. But it is ready. The screens are clean. The belt is within specification. The bearing grease is fresh. The burner nozzle has been cleaned every spring, whether the machine runs that fall or not. Ethan manages most of the farm operation now. People who work with him notice that he tends to ask what's wrong with something before he asks what it costs to replace it. He's quieter than he used to be, more patient with slow problems. There are 4 green notebooks in the farm office drawer. The first one is the shortest. The handwriting in it is his mother's. By the 3rd notebook, the handwriting is mostly his. The old dryer cost $80. The bearing was 14. The belt was 11. The safety switch was 22. Everything else came from the shop or from patients that didn't have a price. Total, $131, a few weekends, and 31 years of knowledge that a man named Harold Geska spent building, and that his daughter had been quietly carrying ever since. That was the part nobody at the auction could see. They saw a rusted machine with a broken belt guard and a seized fan bearing, and they saw exactly what was in front of them. Maggie Turner saw the same machine and understood what it was still capable of. That is not luck. It is not stubbornness. It is what it looks like when someone has learned, slowly, carefully, over years of Saturdays standing next to someone who knew what questions to ask, how to tell the difference between something that is broken and something that is simply waiting to be understood. The machine still runs clean. On a wet October morning, with the fan turning and the burner lit and the temperature gauge sitting steady in the middle of the target range, it sounds like nothing special, which is exactly what it is.